William IV, Count of Holland, ruled with a damaged sphincter that leaked feces and released loud wet gas whenever he bent forward or coughed, the result of chronic intestinal inflammation that destroyed his ability to control his own bowels during state ceremonies and council meetings. Court chroniclers documented how he would suddenly interrupt official business to rush from the room trailing the smell of shit, and how foreign ambassadors reported hearing explosive flatulence during audiences followed by the unmistakable odor of someone who had just soiled themselves. William IV became Count of Holland in 1346 when he was about 28 years old, inheriting control over one of the wealthiest trading regions in medieval Europe at a time when the Low Countries were becoming increasingly important to international commerce. He seemed healthy enough at first, capable of handling the demanding schedule of a medieval ruler who needed to personally oversee military campaigns, preside over legal disputes, manage diplomatic relations with neighboring territories, and maintain the complex web of alliances that kept his lands secure. But sometime in the early 1350s, possibly triggered by a severe intestinal infection or maybe just bad luck with his body's internal plumbing, William developed chronic inflammation of his intestines that would progressively destroy his ability to function as a ruler. The condition started with intermittent bouts of severe abdominal cramping that would double him over in pain, making it impossible to concentrate on anything except the agony radiating from his gut. These episodes would be followed by urgent diarrhea that sent him rushing to the privy multiple times per day, evacuating liquid stool that burned as it passed through his inflamed rectum. Then the pattern would shift and he would go days without any bowel movement at all, his abdomen swelling with trapped gas and hardening feces while the pressure built to unbearable levels. When the constipation finally broke, it would be explosive and painful, forcing hard stool through a rectal passage that was already damaged and inflamed from the previous rounds of diarrhea. This constant alternation between severe constipation and burning diarrhea, month after month and year after year, did cumulative damage to William's lower digestive tract that medieval medicine had absolutely no way to treat or even properly understand. The chronic inflammation weakened the muscles and tissues of his rectum, and the repeated trauma of passing both hard constipated stool and caustic diarrhea damaged the delicate structures that normally allow humans to control when and how they defecate. His anal sphincter, the ring of muscle that keeps the anus closed until you consciously decide to open it, began to fail in ways that would transform him from a functioning ruler into someone who could not trust his own body to behave appropriately in public settings. The damage progressed gradually at first, with William noticing that he would sometimes pass gas involuntarily when he bent over or when he coughed or sneezed, embarrassing moments that he tried to cover by shifting position or clearing his throat loudly. But as the inflammation continued and the sphincter weakened further, these involuntary releases became more frequent and more difficult to disguise, and they were not just gas anymore but sometimes included small amounts of liquid stool that would leak out without warning and soil his undergarments. Court physicians examined him and prescribed various treatments based on medieval medical theory, giving him herbs to balance his humors and recommending different diets, but nothing they tried addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the tissues of his lower bowel were chronically inflamed and the sphincter that controlled his anus was progressively losing its ability to stay closed when it should. The first time William's damaged sphincter betrayed him during an important public event, he was presiding over a judicial hearing where local nobles were presenting a complex land dispute for his judgment. He was seated on his chair of state listening to the arguments and trying to follow the legal intricacies being presented when he felt the familiar cramping in his lower abdomen that signaled his bowels were about to cause problems. He tried to hold everything in through sheer willpower, clenching his damaged sphincter as tightly as he could manage while keeping his face neutral so no one would see that he was struggling internally. But then he had to lean forward slightly to hear something one of the lawyers was saying, and the change in position combined with the pressure in his bowels was too much for his weakened sphincter to resist. A loud, wet-sounding fart erupted from him with enough force that everyone in the room heard it clearly, and the smell that followed seconds later left no doubt about what had just happened. William felt his face burning with humiliation as the nobles and lawyers tried to pretend they had not noticed, but the damage was done and everyone in that room knew that the Count of Holland had just loudly and wetly farted during an official proceeding. Worse than the embarrassment was what he felt in his undergarments afterward, a warm wetness that told him the gas had not been the only thing that escaped when his sphincter gave way. He had to sit there for another hour pretending everything was normal while feeling the fecal matter soaking into his clothing and smelling the odor that was definitely noticeable to anyone sitting close to him, and when the hearing finally ended he walked stiffly back to his chambers trying not to move in ways that would make the soiling more obvious. His servants cleaned him up and disposed of the fouled clothing, and William tried to convince himself that this was an isolated incident that would not happen again. But of course it did happen again, and with increasing frequency as his condition worsened. Council meetings became minefields where he never knew when his body would betray him, forcing him to sit rigidly still and avoid any movement that might trigger an involuntary release. He started keeping his contributions to discussions brief because talking sometimes put pressure on his abdomen that his sphincter could not handle, and he learned to position himself near exits so he could make quick escapes when he felt the warning signs that a more serious accident was imminent. Foreign ambassadors who came to negotiate with the Count of Holland began including strange comments in their reports back to their home countries, carefully worded observations about William's physical instability and his tendency to abruptly end audiences without explanation. Some of these diplomatic dispatches mentioned hearing unusual sounds during meetings with the Count, and a few were bold enough to note that the Count seemed to have difficulty controlling natural bodily functions, though they phrased it in Latin euphemisms that made the meaning clear without being explicitly crude. The watershed moment that made William's condition impossible to hide or ignore came during a major religious ceremony at which his presence was absolutely required because it involved swearing oaths of loyalty from several important vassals. This was the kind of formal occasion where everything followed strict protocol and where the Count's role required him to stand for extended periods, speak ritual phrases at the correct moments, and generally project an image of authority and control that was essential to maintaining the hierarchical structure of medieval power. William knew his bowels had been particularly troublesome that morning, with cramping and urgency that suggested his intestines were inflamed and unreliable, but he could not possibly skip this ceremony without creating a political crisis. He positioned himself at the front of the cathedral where the ritual would take place, standing as still as he could manage while the first vassal approached to make his oath, and he was doing all right until he felt a sneeze building in his sinuses. He tried to suppress it but the sneeze came anyway, his body convulsing with the force of it, and the sudden pressure on his abdomen was more than his damaged sphincter could handle. A loud, explosive fart echoed through the stone cathedral, wet and unmistakable in its implications, and the smell hit the people standing closest to him within seconds. But it was not just gas this time. William could feel the warm semi-liquid feces escaping from his anus and spreading across his buttocks, soaking into his fine ceremonial clothing while he stood there frozen in horror. The vassal who was in the middle of swearing his oath stumbled over his words, clearly distracted by what he had just heard and smelled, and people throughout the cathedral were shifting uncomfortably and exchanging glances that made it clear everyone knew what had just happened. William tried to continue with the ceremony as if nothing was wrong, but the smell was intensifying as the feces spread in his clothing, and he could see people covering their noses and moving back from where he stood. Finally, one of his closest advisors approached and whispered that perhaps the Count should retire briefly to attend to some urgent business, giving him an excuse to leave before the situation became even more catastrophic. William walked out of the cathedral with as much dignity as he could muster given that he was trailing the smell of his own shit and leaving a room full of nobles and clergy who would spend the rest of the day discussing what they had just witnessed. The ceremony had to be postponed and rescheduled, and the story spread through Holland and beyond with remarkable speed, becoming one of those incidents that everyone knows about and talks about even though officially pretending it never happened. Foreign courts heard about the Count of Holland shitting himself during a major state ceremony, and while diplomatic correspondence used more delicate language, the meaning was clear enough. William's ability to command respect and authority had been severely damaged by his body's very public failure, and everyone who dealt with him from that point forward did so with the knowledge that he might literally soil himself at any moment. After the cathedral incident made his condition common knowledge throughout the region, William's approach to governance had to adapt to the reality that his body could not be trusted to behave appropriately during extended public appearances. He began drastically reducing the length of audiences and meetings, keeping sessions to 30 minutes or less when possible because that was about how long he could reasonably trust his damaged sphincter to maintain control. Longer meetings were simply too risky given that his intestinal cramping could come on suddenly and his sphincter might give way at any moment, so he started delegating more and more of the actual decision-making to his inner circle of advisors who could spend the necessary time on complex negotiations without worrying about their bowels betraying them. Foreign ambassadors who traveled to meet with the Count of Holland found themselves dealing primarily with his representatives rather than with William himself, and when they did get face-to-face time with the Count it was always brief and often cut shorter when William would suddenly excuse himself and rush from the room without explanation. Everyone knew why he was leaving, the smell of shit or the sound of wet gas having announced his condition before he made his exit, but diplomatic protocol required maintaining the fiction that nothing unusual was happening. William spent an increasing amount of time in his private chambers, particularly in or near the privy where he could deal with his malfunctioning bowels without an audience. The chronic inflammation meant he was constantly dealing with either painful constipation that made sitting on the toilet an ordeal of straining and discomfort, or with burning diarrhea that had him running to the privy multiple times per hour. The damaged sphincter meant that even when he was not actively having a bowel movement, he was leaking small amounts of fecal matter and gas that required frequent cleaning and changes of undergarments. His servants became experts at managing his condition, keeping spare clothing ready at all times and discreetly cleaning up after accidents, but nothing they did could address the fundamental problem that the Count's body was no longer capable of the basic control that his position required. The political consequences of his physical condition became increasingly obvious as other nobles and administrators realized they could make decisions without bothering to consult William since he was unlikely to be available for meaningful discussion anyway. Important matters that should have required the Count's direct involvement were being handled by committees and councils that operated with minimal oversight from the actual ruler, and William found himself becoming a figurehead whose main role was to occasionally show up and put his seal on documents that others had already decided. He was aware of what was happening, aware that he was being slowly pushed aside by his own body's failures, but he had no real solution because the alternative was trying to maintain a full schedule of public appearances and meetings while risking constant humiliation from his inability to control his bowels. By the final years of William's reign in the late 1350s, he had essentially become invisible as a political force, spending most of his time sequestered in his private quarters dealing with the progressively worsening inflammation and damage to his digestive system. The chronic intestinal problems that had started as intermittent episodes had evolved into a constant state of dysfunction, with his bowels never truly healthy and his sphincter so damaged that controlling his defecation had become nearly impossible even under the best circumstances. He could no longer attend any public ceremony or official gathering without risking the kind of humiliating accident that had happened in the cathedral, and even private meetings were difficult because his damaged sphincter would leak gas and fecal matter whenever he moved or shifted position. The smell that surrounded him had become a permanent feature of his presence, a combination of the feces that leaked constantly from his damaged anus and the infected tissue of his chronically inflamed rectum, and people who had to meet with him would position themselves as far away as possible while still maintaining the minimal standards of respect that protocol required. Foreign ambassadors stopped requesting personal audiences with William because they knew they would either be turned away or subjected to brief awkward meetings where the Count might fart or shit himself at any moment, and it was simply easier to conduct their business with his advisors who could control their own bodies reliably. The real power in Holland had shifted completely to the council of nobles and administrators who made decisions in William's name but without his meaningful input, essentially running the territory as a collective while maintaining the legal fiction that the count was still in charge. William himself seemed to have accepted this arrangement because the alternative would have required him to somehow overcome a physical condition that was beyond medieval medicine's ability to treat, and after years of humiliation and public accidents he was probably relieved to withdraw from public life even if it meant surrendering the power he had inherited. He died in 1358 at around 40 years old, probably from complications related to the chronic intestinal inflammation that had destroyed his ability to rule and his dignity, and when his body was prepared for burial the attendants noted the extensive damage to his lower bowel that had caused him so much misery. Holland passed to new rulers who had functional digestive systems, and William's reign was remembered primarily for how graphically it demonstrated that a leader whose body cannot be trusted to behave appropriately in public will eventually lose the ability to lead regardless of their technical legal authority. The chroniclers who wrote about his reign were remarkably frank about his medical condition, documenting the intestinal problems and the damaged sphincter and the constant accidents in detail that would have been considered too crude for most historical records. But apparently they felt that accurately describing what had happened to William was more important than maintaining polite fictions about royal dignity. Modern historians studying these chronicles have a surprisingly clear picture of exactly what went wrong with William's body and how it destroyed his capacity to govern, making him one of the few medieval rulers whose medical problems are documented with enough detail to make a retroactive diagnosis possible. The lesson that emerged from his disastrous reign was simple but important. Physical control of one's own body is a prerequisite for political control over others, and a ruler who cannot manage his own sphincter will eventually find that no one is willing to follow his leadership in anything else either.